So, as I've already said, the aim of this session is to give you all some key points of information to assist you in supporting your employees back to work. So today we're going to be covering absences. So what do you do if someone's off sick with COVID-19 symptoms, and how do you manage any absence triggers that you might have set? The test and trace system. So what is it? What should you do if an employee is contacted by test and trace? A bit of an update on shielding. So employees who have been absent due to shielding, when can they return and what do you need to do? Something we've just added in recently is the issue with regard to quarantine. Obviously, with the recent restrictions surrounding Spain, a lot of people are asking us for advice on that. Reluctant employees. So what about those employees who are just too scared to return, or maybe they've still got childcare issues, or they just don't want to come back to work? How are we going to deal with those? We're also going to cover home working. So what do you need to consider for future? Contract variations for when you need to reduce your hours or your working patterns for your staff. And then we're going to look finally at restructure and redundancy and what happens when you need to make cuts. So starting with the beginning of absences then. So as I'm sure we're probably all aware by now, the main symptoms of COVID-19 are a high temperature, and that is that you are hot to touch on your chest or back. So the guidance suggests you don't have to take your temperature, it's just if you feel hot to touch on your chest or your back. A new continuous cough. Now that is defined as coughing a lot for more than an hour, or 3 or more coughing episodes in 24 hours. And a loss or change to your sense of smell or taste. So you can't smell or taste anything, or things smell or taste different. If any of your employees display any of those symptoms, they must self-isolate. Now the government have just announced this morning that self-isolation period is actually for a period of 10 days. And I haven't updated my slide, I do apologise. It's literally news that's just come out this morning. Anyone in their household or their support bubble has to self-isolate for 14 days. If their symptoms don't persist beyond this time, or if the cough or the smell and taste changes remain but they haven't worsened, they can then return to work. What we recommend is that you check in with your employee a couple of days before they're due back to find out how they are and discuss their return to work. In addition to self-isolating, anyone who has any of the 3 symptoms can also now arrange a test. And this is within the first 5 days of displaying symptoms. If any of your employees or people you are working with have symptoms, please ask them to visit the NHS website where they can arrange their test. This can either be done in a testing centre, or they can apply for a home test kit. As far as I'm aware, the testing that's done on site takes about 72 hours to come back. Home testing kits can be a little bit longer because it's obviously dependent upon the person that sends them back. If an employee manages to get a test result back before their initial 10-day isolation, and if that test is negative, they can return to work at any point in time from there on in, provided that no one that they live with or who is in their support bubble has symptoms. We recommend you follow up with your employees to ensure that they've arranged their test, and again to discuss the results and their potential return to work. Now obviously, if they're still feeling ill, even though they get a negative test, it still may be wise to allow them to remain off so they're not passing other bugs around the workplace. At present, employees who have to self-isolate because they or someone in their household has symptoms are still eligible for statutory sick pay from day 1 of their absence, so that hasn't changed at the moment. Please ask them to obtain a self-isolation note from the NHS 111 online service, and that will validate their absence. It's all done electronically. We are going to provide you with a handy checklist at the end, and that will include some useful websites for you and for your employees to visit. In terms of absence management then, you might need to make some adjustments to your absence management policy, specifically to the triggers for absences and when you escalate that to a disciplinary or capability proceeding. So it wouldn't be appropriate to include COVID-19 related absences in your absence management process. You really don't want employees who have got symptoms attending work because they're too scared of facing disciplinary action. They might already be on a final written warning for attendance, and then they come to work because they don't want to be dismissed. That's obviously putting everybody at unnecessary risk. Where an employee is absent due to COVID-19, what we recommend is that you keep a track of that absence and carry out your standard return to work meeting or process. But when you're actually reviewing any absence trigger points, discounting that from your absence processes. Please also remember to be considerate of other illnesses. So we've all been kept away from the usual cold, flu and stomach bugs that make the rounds, and our immune systems are going to be lowered. You know, there are still those summer flus and things going around at the moment, and it's highly likely that you will see higher sickness absence rates for a while. It's really important to encourage your employees to take the time off to recover and avoid passing those germs around their colleagues. So do follow your procedures for managing absence, but take that into account when deciding whether or not to issue a warning or even move for a dismissal. You might also have employees who have lost family members or friends, and that could be either due to COVID or due to something else, but obviously they've not perhaps had the same grief time that they would normally have had. Returning to work might cause them more grief and more distress, and they're going to need some time to come to terms with what's new. So be there to support them, and again, be sensitive to this when you are reviewing your absence triggers. This has been a really difficult period for most people in a wide variety of ways, and it's highly likely that you're going to come across employees who are struggling with their mental health. Please don't be afraid to ask them, how are you, and to offer some support to them. There are lots of ways you can support employees through periods of poor mental health. And if they do need time off, it's really important that they don't feel pressurised by potential warnings or disciplinary proceedings. And it's really important as well that you stay in touch with them and make sure you take steps to help them maintain the routine of work. I've already mentioned that tests are available now for those displaying the COVID-19 symptoms. What happens if that test returns a positive result? Well, the NHS Test and Trace service will ask that person for details of anyone they've had recent close contact with. That's within 2 meters. They will then contact those individuals. So if you have an employee who is contacted by the Test and Trace service, this is how the process works. They are alerted usually by a text message or by email by the Test and Trace service, and they're asked to log on to the NHS Test and Trace website to review their situation. They may then be told to isolate for 14 days from the last day of contact with the person who's tested positive. So that's not from the day they were notified, it's from the last day they were in contact with that person. As I've already indicated previously, that would be on statutory sick pay for any period that they can't attend work. And they might get a notification from the NHS Test and Trace that they can use as proof of absence, but again, if not, you can always ask them to complete that self-isolation notice online. They'll also then be told to go and get a test themselves, especially if they develop symptoms. Now, if that test is negative, they still have to complete their 14-day isolation period. So if they're contacted by Test and Trace and the test results come back as negative, they still have to complete that 14-day isolation period before returning to work. And that's because we're still a bit unclear as to the incubation periods for COVID. It could be that they test negative for the first few days, and then after day 6 or 7 or 8, they then present it with a positive test. Again, keep a record of these absences, but we're not counting those towards any of our absence triggers, and just be guided by the Test and Trace service as to what to do next. People who have been shielding, so that's the most vulnerable people that have got usually quite serious health conditions, are able to return to work on the 1st of August. I mean, that's a Saturday, so they're probably presumably not going to be returning on the 1st, but they are able to return to work from that point in time. If they can work from home, we recommend that you still allow them to, but if not, then they are able to return to the workplace. Of course, just because the government has said they should return, it doesn't mean they're going to want to. So what are the options when you have an employee who's been shielding? Well, in part, that depends on what you've done with them during their period of shielding. So were they on furlough or were they on statutory sick pay? If they were on statutory sick pay, that entitlement will end on the 31st of July. They will not be eligible for that anymore. So unless their GP signs them off as unfit to return to work, they'll either have to take annual leave or take unpaid leave, or they'll have to use to return to work, If they were on furlough because they were shielding and that was the only reason they were on furlough, come the 31st of July, that will also no longer be eligible for furlough because the reason for furlough will no longer exist. So again, you'll need to explore those other options with them. But if you've had them on furlough for other reasons as well, such as childcare or due to the fact that you do have a downturn in work, they can remain on furlough, because the reasons still exist. They still have the issue with childcare, or they still have the issue of lack of work. So you can keep them on furlough or on flexible furlough until the scheme ends in October. So it's time to plan ahead on that. So you need to be having those conversations as soon as possible with any employees you are intending to bring back. And this also applies to anyone who's been caring for someone who's been shielding as well. And get a plan in place for their safe and effective return to work. This is where we recommend a return to work meeting is absolutely crucial. So anyone who's been shielding is probably going to have been more socially isolated. They are likely to have poor mental health. They may feel overwhelmed and quite unsafe about returning to the workplace and really worried about catching the virus. You need to talk their concerns through with them. Share your COVID-19 risk assessment. So to return people back to a workplace, you must have a COVID-19 risk assessment in place. You might even need to amend that risk assessment to cover those shielding employees and any extra measures that are required for them. Remember as well, it's really likely that any employees who've been told to shield will probably be classed as disabled, and you are obliged to consider all reasonable adjustments to help them return to work. So if they have to take public transport to work and back, you need to consider how you can help them with this. They might be really reluctant to get on that bus. Ultimately, we're not doctors, we're not medics, so encourage your employees to consult with their medical team if they are still concerned. They will be best placed to offer support, they will be best placed to offer recommendations, and if necessary can certify that person as unfit to work if that is a consideration. So I'm sure you all remember the quarantine rules that seemed to be lifted as soon as they were imposed back in June. Now we're facing new quarantine rules. So when does quarantine apply? So for anyone entering the UK, the rules are that they must self-isolate for 14 days unless they're coming from within the common travel area, so that's Ireland, Channel Islands or Isle of Man, unless they're coming from British overseas territories or one of the countries on the approved list. Now this list changes every day, and it's a huge list of different countries that are approved or not approved. And there is a list available on the government website for anyone who wants to have a look at that. At the moment, some of the common countries that are in that list include places like France and Germany. But as we all know, it's been in the news recently, Spain is no longer on that approved list. And it's caused a lot of worry for employers whose employees have already booked and paid for holidays, and they now face the prospect of having to quarantine for another 14 days after their holiday. We've been asked a lot of times by employers, can they cancel their employees' holiday if they're intending to travel to an area that's not on that approved list? Well, legally, yes, you can. So under working time regulations, regulation 15, an employer can cancel a pre-approved holiday as long as they give enough notice. Now that is equal to the length of the holiday period. So if your employee has a week booked, you have to give them at least a week's notice to cancel. But there's a bit more of a moral argument to this. So if your employee has already paid for their travel and accommodation, this might cause a massive problem. You could end up being liable to reimburse them for their costs, and your employee could put in a grievance, or they could even argue that you've breached the implied terms of trust and confidence. They resign and then they claim constructive dismissal, and they'd have a really solid case for that. So this is not something we would recommend. If you are in a position that your employee does need to quarantine, then what should you do about that? So government guidance has been updated recently on this. The guidance now expressly states that anyone quarantining from abroad is not eligible for statutory sick pay unless they have symptoms or someone in their household has symptoms. We recommend that you talk through with your employee their holiday plans. Are they able to work from home on their return so that they can effectively quarantine? Can they rearrange their plans? So maybe a conversation needs to take place with their travel agent or travel insurance. Can they take additional holiday to cover the 14 days isolation? So if they've got enough holiday left, they could still use that time. It also means they've got less holiday to take further on in the year or carry forward into the next couple of years. They might be able to take some unpaid leave for those 2 weeks if that's not too much of an issue for you. But if there's a way you could pay them for that time, that might be good. So could you pay them and have them make up the hours throughout the next couple of 3 months maybe? Discuss all the options with them and try to reach a suitable agreement that won't penalise your employees unnecessarily. It's quite likely that you'll be facing a range of objections from employees about returning to work. And if you've already started having those conversations, you may be familiar with some of those objections. The biggest one is obviously going to be about employees feeling nervous or anxious or just too scared to return to the workplace. Now, it's really important to make sure you carry out those return to work meetings, and we suggest you do that with every single employee, where you can discuss their concerns, alleviate them where possible, and come up with a plan of action if they're still not convinced about returning. So your return to work meeting should cover things such as, how do they feel about returning? Are they anxious? Are they excited? What safety measures have you put in place for them? So read through that COVID-19 risk assessment you've done, be specific about what you're doing what they need to do to protect themselves as well, and how they raise concerns if safety procedures aren't being carried out by other people. Have they got issues that are making them reluctant to return? We've already talked about childcare and the possibility of not wanting to take public transport, or that they may have a relative who's shielding or poorly, so talk through that with them. It's great to encourage them to think positively about not only their experience over the past few months, but also about returning to work. So a good question to ask them might be, what have they missed about being in work? And what have they enjoyed about being at home? So that they can think positively about both parts of it. It's really important to ask them how their mental health is. So how will they tell you if their mental health is suffering? How will they tell you if they're not okay? Everyone needs handling differently, and making sure your team feel comfortable about opening up to you is really important. And also be honest about the plans for the future. Your team, especially if they've been on furlough, are really likely to feel nervous about the future of the business. There are news stories coming out left, right and centre about redundancies. Reassure them where possible, discuss plans for the future and how you're going to get back to full operation. But please be honest with them. If you are having to consider cuts and redundancies, please don't tell them everything's going to be okay and then spring it on them in another month's time. Be honest that redundancies may be possible, but you're doing all you can to avoid that. At the moment, if your employee still has childcare issues because their school or nursery just isn't open, or their child is not allowed back at school, they can still remain on furlough, and that is still a legitimate reason. And you would obviously need to discuss this with them and try and reach an agreement. If their school or nursery is open and they've simply chosen not to send their child back, I appreciate the schools are now on summer holidays, but certainly nurseries, they've just chosen not to send their child back, that's a different matter, and you may need to have a conversation with them about arrangements for that. Once you've gone through all of this with your employee, you've offered them that support, you've showed them how you're going to keep them safe, dealt with their objections, you've agreed on a return to work plan, hopefully they'll feel much less anxious about coming back. But if you are still having problems after this, please do reach out to us for some guidance. We're always happy to help people, and there are a few different options for resolving those situations. We know that home working has increased by a massive 38% throughout COVID. So employers who never considered it an option before have been forced to embrace the concept of home working for their employees. Now, you might find your employees have got used to working from home, or that they prefer the work-life balance that their recent flexibility has given them, in which case you may get some flexible working requests. Now, provided your employees have 26 weeks service, they have the right to apply for flexible working, and that applies to everybody over that service length. What they should do is explain in their request why they want to change their working pattern and how they feel this will impact on them, their workload and the team as a whole. You do need to consider these requests carefully, but you can say no, provided you have a legitimate business reason for doing so. And there's about 8 different reasons that you can give for that. We're massive advocates for flexible working, and we encourage our clients to be as flexible as work allows. But there's also a place for having people come together as part of a team, and having everyone work from home can create its own challenges. On the flip side of that, many business owners have got their reservations about allowing employees to work from home, and these are usually kind of based around the trust issues. So how do I know they're not just watching Netflix all day? So do take the time to consider those employees' requests in full, but take a quick review of how working from home has impacted them during the past few weeks, presuming that's what they've been doing. While they were working from home, were they productive? Did they stay in touch with you? Did you feel confident that work was getting done? If they've been really rubbish and they've not done any of those things, it's probably not a good idea to allow them to work from home as a long-term thing. But if they've met your expectations or even exceeded those, because we do know that a lot of people do get more productive when they're allowed to work from home, then why not consider making it a more permanent arrangement? It doesn't have to be a full-time arrangement. You could choose a few days out of the week to allow it to happen. Whatever you do, if you agree to a home working arrangement, you'll also need to make sure you carry out a home working risk assessment. You'll need to come to an agreement on equipment, so who provides it, who pays for it, who owns it, and also think about things like security of data and any monitoring that you want to put in place. So how often do you want your employees to check in with managers? Are you putting some kind of monitoring software onto their computer or their phone, for example? And what attendance do you actually require at the office? So if you have a monthly team meeting that they must attend, detail that there. Ultimately, both you and your employee, need to feel comfortable with whatever you agree on. If you find yourself in a position where you now need to change the terms of an employee's contract, so you might want to reduce the hours or their working days or salary or take their commission off them for a short period, You have to follow a fair process for this. Now, that includes notifying the employee of the proposed changes and the reasons behind them, asking them for their consent, and then acting accordingly. The key to contract variation is in the communication and how well you deliver your explanation to your employee to start off with. If you do it well, hopefully your employee will be happy to sign your new contract. So you then confirm that in writing, ask them to sign that they're agreed, and that's you done. But what if an employee won't agree to vary their contract, despite the fact that you've got a valid rationale? You're going to have to attempt to resolve their objections. This is in the form of arranging a meeting with them to discuss their concerns, answer their questions, and consider solutions where possible. Give them a bit more time to think about it, back this up in writing, and ask them to reconsider signing their new contract. Hold a follow-up meeting at that point to see if you can finalise things. Try to work with the employee where possible to come to an agreement that suits you both. Also, you need to be clear if this is a temporary or permanent change. With all the best intentions, there are times when an employee just won't agree, and those employees will need to be invited to a formal consultation meeting. They need to be advised that they may be dismissed and offered re-engagement on new terms, and they'll have the right to be accompanied at this stage. Now, it can get pretty complicated, and there is a really high risk of unfair dismissal and possibly discrimination claims at this stage. So if you find yourself in this position, do seek advice from your HR team before you confirm any dismissal. If you're considering restructuring and the possibility of redundancy, again, you need to make sure you have a clear rationale behind what you are doing and you follow a fair selection process. We get asked a lot about using redundancy as a way to remove underperforming or poor employees from a business. This is not a legitimate or legal reason for redundancy. Redundancy is purely about the role. The legal reasons for redundancy are very clear. So the employer has to have ceased or intend to cease business. The work the employee carries out must have ceased or diminished or is expected to do so. Or the need to conduct that work at a set location has ceased or diminished or is expected to do so. Those are the only three legal reasons you can make someone redundant. Sometimes a redundancy process can be really straightforward. So you've got one employee doing one role in one location and you just don't need that role anymore. But if you have got a team that are all doing the same role, you'll need to follow a fair selection process. So let's take a sales team as an example of this. You've got 10 sales guys who operate in the Northwest. They all have their own individual areas, but the areas do overlap, and in reality, each of them could cover all of the areas. You've decided you need to reduce staffing costs because your sales team are costing you too much money. They're not bringing enough revenue in, and you need to make cuts. You've done all your figures, and you know you can manage with a team of 8 going forward. This will ensure that all the areas are covered effectively and there's enough work for everyone, and it will make it easier for the remaining sales team to hit their targets. So it's really tempting to look at some of the more traditional methods like last in, first out, or your face doesn't fit, so it's you, or maybe you're the youngest. But each of these methods is flawed. So what if you get rid of your one superstar sales guy just because he was the last one to join? Or what if you're facing an age discrimination tribunal because you chose the youngest person, or maybe the oldest person? So this is where a scoring matrix comes in. You would choose sort of between 6 to 8 criteria here, and these could be based on skills, qualifications, ability, performance reviews, targets, attendance, disciplinary record. As long as it's measurable and fair, you can choose the most appropriate. Once you've put your employees at risk of redundancy, you then need to share the selection matrix with them and ask if they think the criteria are fair. You would then set about scoring each individual employee, and it might be worth getting more than one person involved in this process if that doesn't breach any confidentiality. If you both complete the scoring individually and see if your scores match, it just helps to make sure that that scoring process is not clouded by personal feeling. Take a look at the overall scores, and your 2 lowest, or depending on which way you've weighted your scoring highest, the 2 lowest scoring employees are the 2 you have then identified for redundancy. At your next formal consultation meeting, you would then need to discuss the employee's individual score with them and ask if they agree with that. Provided you've got measurable criteria, you should be able to justify your scores and provide proof if necessary. You'd then notify the 2 employees you've identified for redundancy that you're confirming this and proceed with their dismissal. But don't forget to tell the remaining 8 that they're no longer at risk of redundancy and retain their employment. When you're planning a redundancy process, you also need to bear in mind, if you have more than 20 redundancies to make, you must consult for a minimum of 30 days before dismissing. and this increases to 45 days if there's more than 100 redundancies. If you're making fewer than 20 redundancies, there isn't an official consultation length. We generally advise approximately 2 weeks, but that could be shortened in some very, very simple situations, especially if your employees are under 2 years service. If your employees are on furlough, you can still claim the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme grant throughout a notice period. That has to be a working notice period, so they would remain on furlough but effectively be working and not pay in lieu of notice. So it's really worth planning ahead to try and reduce your overheads as much as possible. You can also enforce annual leave during that notice period or at any point in time, even if they're on furlough, but you have to give the right notice. So double the time you want them to take. So if you wanted them to take a week's leave, you would have to give them 2 weeks notice. We recommend keeping employees on furlough for as long as is reasonably possible before making them redundant. The scheme was set up as a way to avoid redundancies, so it's only fair and right that it is used in the spirit it was intended. At the end of July, you will start to incur some small costs on the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. Throughout August, you can still claim your 80%, but you are unable to then reclaim your employer's national insurance and pension contributions. Come September, you will then factor in another 10% of wage, and come October, another 20% of the wage. So consider how much you can afford and get the timing right. One last word about redundancy. Reputational damage can be just as bad as the legal recourse of getting it wrong. Redundancies are never a pleasant place to be in, whichever side of the table you are sat on. But if you handle them well and you support your employees, you can hopefully avoid them telling the world what an awful place you are to work. And if you don't believe that this can happen, just think about some of the press reports recently about places like Sports Direct and Wetherspoons and the backlash they've received for their treatment of their staff. And that's pretty much everything. So thanks so much for listening, and I really hope that you found this informative. If you do have any questions, please now do speak up on the chat or on the Q&A section. Remember, I can't hear you talking, so I will need you just to speak up on the chat or the Q&A, and I will address those questions.